G'day and welcome to Digging Deeper Ag Chats with Al. In this episode, I'm joined by long-time agronomist and soil health legend Cam Nicholson. We're diving into how fertilisers really work, the link between fat leaves and smart grazing, and how to make every nutrient dollar count. Plus, Cam opens up about the human side of farming, from big decisions to mental health, and celebrating the quiet wins. This one's practical, powerful, and packed with takeaways. Let's get into it. Welcome, Cam, to Digging Deeper.
G'day, Al.
Now, we've had a whole bunch of people in at the Gippsland Ag Centre just recently talking about soil fertility and a whole lot of things along that area. We're going to start from the very beginning. Simply, how do fertilisers work on plants and what role do they play in the soil health?
Yeah. So fertilisers obviously hugely important, or nutrients hugely important in pasture production. What people I think sometimes don't recognise is that to get the maximum value out of those nutrients, it's about managing leaf. Because I coined the phrase that fertiliser grows fat leaves, not fast leaves.
Right.
So leaves emerge from a plant and are influenced by the temperature and the moisture that plant experiences. But once that leaf comes out, how long that leaf is and how wide that leaf blade is, in other words, how big or how fat, for want of another word, those leaves are, is highly dependent on the nutrients that it's got. So if it's starved of nutrients, it will grow small leaves.
Right.
Okay. If it's got lots of nutrients, it will grow big leaves. It'll maximise that leaf production and therefore maximise sunlight interception and those sort of things.
Yeah.
But that also means that it's very closely linked to your grazing management. Because if you think I've put nutrients on to grow fat leaves, but then I graze those leaves off, you can't get fat leaves if you don't have leaves.
Yeah.
So the idea of fertiliser or nutrients being tied to grazing management and the ability of that plant to grow leaves without being grazed is a super important part of getting the maximum value out of the nutrients you apply.
Right. Now, you've been an agronomist for many years. Where did that actually journey start for you?
It started with the Department of Ag. So I did ag science. Finished in the early 80s and then was very lucky to have 5 or 6 years with the Victorian Department of Agriculture. And so I had an interest in soils when I went through uni, soils and ag engineering, that sort of stuff. So I really liked the soil plant side of it, probably more so than the livestock side of it.
Yeah. You would have been one of the earlier guys looking at soils back then, were you?
There was some really good researchy stuff going on. This is when the department or when the state government had a soils laboratory and all your analysis. You used to send your soils to the state chemistry laboratory and they used to do the analysis for you before there were private companies and all that stuff. I started up in that era. We had some very good soil scientists, so I learned some really good information about the fundamentals of soils and plant interactions and plant-water interactions and those things.
Yeah.
And was very fortunate to be able to do some really good early fundamental research.
Yeah.
And have some really good teachers in that space, which sort of set me up understanding the theory behind it. And then I was fortunate enough that my father-in-law, who wasn't a farmer, had bought a few acres.
He wasn't a farmer?
He wasn't a farmer. I'd say bought a few acres. He was a professional in Melbourne.
And you're not from a farm originally either, is that correct?
No, in fact, my parents both came from farms, but small farms, big families. So they ended up moving to Melbourne. So no association with farming for that period, but I just had an interest in it. So, did ag science and got back into that sort of space. But it was then the opportunity to try and practice some of that theory. And there's nothing better if you're using your own money.
Yeah, a bit of skin in the game sorts you out, doesn't
absolutely.
it? Yeah.
Absolutely. So I, in a sense, refined how that works. And you think, the theory's great, but in reality or practicality, I can't quite do this or can't do that. And just refined that.
How big was the gap for you from theory to practical?
Reasonably big.
Yeah.
Reasonably big. Yeah. It sounds great in theory and works in a glass house or works in a research trial.
Yeah.
But then you get it out in the paddock and it's bloody wet and cows have pugged it all up and why am I not seeing the response I wanted? Or you have the classic, do your soil test, because if you do a soil test then you'll know what's deficient and you can put that on.
Yeah.
And you need to be reaching these targets to get maximum production. And I do the sums and I go, I've only got a quarter of that money. So now what am I going to do? Where's best bang for my buck? And do I just focus on this paddock, or do I do 2 paddocks and only do half in each or something? So it was more that sort of practical application and the logistics of how do you do this at a farm level. You look at some of the pastures and go, gee, they're pretty run down, but it still has a bit of phalaris there, and it's got a bit of subclover there. Do I spend it on fertiliser, or do I resow it? Or can I manage my way out of that and encourage the subclover to grow, or encourage the phalaris to grow, or the ryegrass to grow? So I had to apply that theory in a real life situation.
Yeah.
We talked before about fertiliser growing fat leaves, and you've got to spell pastures. But if animals are going to go somewhere,
if they're hungry, you've got to find something.
You've got to find somewhere to put them. So I suppose it's working through the compromises and still getting the best result. That's what you can't be taught in the theory, but comes with experience and comes with application.
Now, you've been consulting for quite a few years. Tell us about your switch from a reliable, high-paying, I shouldn't say high-paying job, but a reliable job into consulting, because you're quite young when you stepped into that space.
I was. Yeah, it's a funny story that, but my wife had been working with the Weekly Times. She was a journalist there for a number of years, and I'd done 5 or 6 years in the ag department, and I really enjoyed that opportunity of what I was just talking about, trying to solve problems at the farm sort of systems level with individual clients. And it was just the time the Department of Agriculture was moving away from what historically they used to provide one-to-one advice. And that was then being withdrawn, and that's where we started getting these crops of consultants or advisors coming through. So what we see is the norm now of having a lot of private advisors. When I started, there was hardly one. You count them on one hand, because the government used to provide that service, and anyway, for whatever reason they decided not to.
Did a lot of them come out of AgVic?
Yes,
or the government?
Quite a few. Yeah, quite a few of the experienced ones. And so I was just on the sort of tail end of that when I started moving out, but that's what I really liked. I was passionate about that. I loved trying to do that farm systems, problem solving, and so I thought, I don't know, for better or worse, I'll have a crack at it. So anyway, I went and jumped ship, and then AgVic said, could you come back for a couple of days a week just to finish off some work for the next 12 or 18 months, which was great because it gave me a chance to establish myself in the private sector while still having at least some. But I do remember vividly the day that I quit the ag department. My wife, we have got twin girls, and my wife was in hospital. She'd had the girls the day before, and I just came in and said, surprise, honey, I've just resigned from the ag department. I'm going full-time consulting. So that was a bit of a shock to the system. But
what was the third thing then? They always say these things come in 3. Was there a big third thing that happened at the same time? You didn't move house or something?
We were renovating the house at the time. So Fiona had to stay in hospital for another 2 days with the girls because I hadn't finished the nursery. So I was working during the day and then painting all night to try and get the... So there was a bit happening at that time. But I jumped on that, worked in private agronomy, and I've still got clients that I started with 30-odd years ago. There are some that I don't have, but there are some that I really enjoy and we get on well and our personalities match. But then I was offered quite a bit of work with large projects. In Victoria, it was what was called the Grasslands Productivity Program, which was a groundbreaking program years ago, which was all around grazing management, fertilizer, species management. So it put all that together. It's exactly what I was interested in, and that program was there.
So we still use those concepts or that program?
The whole idea of rotational grazing that people now look at and go, well, that's just what you do, isn't it? No, that was all new. Everybody was set stocking. And this idea of putting bigger mobs together, spelling paddocks, and I remember going on farms in those days, and the 2-year-old wethers stayed in that paddock for the year, and the 3-year-old wethers stayed in that paddock for the year. And if the paddock wasn't very productive, then the stocking rate was lower.
Right.
But that was it. You wouldn't think to put your 2- and 3-year-olds together and rotate them round and have a paddock that's spelled that then grows back, and it comes back to that fertiliser stuff with the fat leaves. Spelling a paddock, all of a sudden you get better response out of your fertiliser. Guess what? You carry more animals on the same amount of land.
And once those little solar panels, those leaves get up and the photosynthesis starts happening, it's a lot more benefits then as well.
Absolutely. So, that makes me sound really old, but that was all new at the time. And then I got an opportunity I got involved in some land care stuff and did that for 25 years as well, but it had a very strong pasture grazing base on that, just out of Ballarat. But then there was another program called Grain and Graze that started, which was a mixed farming one of cropping and livestock. And it was how you determined the ratio of crop to livestock you had and how you could use livestock in grazing. So again, now a lot of people graze their crops in winter, and their grazing of stubble is far more sophisticated than it used to be, but that was all new at that time. So that was sort of a 20-year.
So has that ratio changed significantly with your work?
We're getting more crop and less livestock.
Oh, really?
Yeah, quite a bit to do with profitability of it, particularly of the sheep side of the industry, where a lot of cattle are run, it's too wet to actually crop effectively. But the sheep one is where we're seeing that sort of substitute in the two happening.
Yeah.
So that was close to 2 decades in that sort of space. A lot around sort of farm decision making and understanding risk and volatility and all of those things that took me to a different level of understanding the farm system. And living it yourself, you were experiencing that as well as being able to learn and apply that.
Assume most of your producers would really appreciate the fact that you were living through a lot of those experiences with them, especially in the tough times.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And the flip side of that is, what do we do to make the good times great?
Yes.
Because I think there's certainly something in farming about when we have a good year, we think, oh, it's not a good year, and we just sort of tick along. When in fact the good year's got all of the things that are outside our control set up for you. We don't want to be the limitation to growing more stuff.
Right.
So things like the time when we use the most nitrogen and really pin our ears back and invest a lot is when seasons and prices are stacking up for us, but particularly seasons. We want to make good years great. And if that means that we cut another 2 or 3 paddocks for hay or silage and then we put that away, we might use that for the next 5 years. But when you get into a drought year, you've got a bigger reserve than you would have had otherwise. So otherwise that opportunity goes. Doesn't present itself very often, but when it does, let's not just go, oh, it's in a good year, we're ticking along now, it's nice. Go, nah,
Make
we're
the
going to
most.
absolutely nail this.
Now, I was reading in the notes, another significant moment in your life is when you lost a farming mentor to suicide.
Yeah.
Are you happy to share about that?
Yeah. That was very early on, and it's continued my interest in understanding how we deal with the stresses in farming. There was some work done a few years ago by the Australian Farm Institute, and it basically identified that agriculture's the riskiest part of the Australian economy, if you look at the gross income associated with that, and that Australian agriculture is the riskiest agriculture around the world. So when you put that in, Australian farmers are playing the riskiest game in town. You know, it's not the mining sector, it's not the retail sector, it's not real estate, it's farming, where the greatest risk is. And there are some enormous pressures that we feel when things are challenging. And I had, someone, I'd only been out 2 or 3 years, but as I went through university, I worked with him for a long time. So I actually spent months and months on their place as a farm worker, and he was a really intelligent, really lovely person. And I couldn't quite get my head around why something like that would happen. And recognising those sort of things. But it just drilled home to me that sometimes this job can be really overwhelming, and we need to find ways to recognise that, to help each other in that. And the flip side of that is to celebrate the good times. And I don't think we do that enough to build that bank of when times are bad. Yeah,
and it's almost like an Australian sentiment that we bring ourselves down a little bit in those when we're succeeding and kicking goals, isn't it? So.
Yeah, and it's only the last couple of years that if I can digress a bit and tell a story. I was doing a group just out of Horsham, and we were sitting in the wool shed, and this is only 6 months ago, and they'd had a really tough time because they've had a shocking season in that sort of part of the world, and they were lambing down when they had no feed. They'd had them in containment up until point of lambing, but they knew if they lambed down in containment areas,
it's a nightmare, isn't it?
Absolute disaster. So they had to go out in the paddock. And cut a long story short, they'd worked out a whole lot of really innovative ways of dealing with this. And they finished up at the end and goes, oh, we dodged a bullet there. Our lambing percentage was still really good. And I just said, well, just stop for a second and let's just unpack what you actually did,
what they
how
achieved.
you did it.
Yeah.
And they just accepted that, oh, yeah, well, that's just what you do. I said, no, do you understand the skill to be able to execute that well? You are actually really top class in this. And they go, oh, no, we just farm, that's just what we do. And I said, no, just pause, because this is serious. You have done an exceptionally good job. You know? And they just said, oh, well, that's just farming, that's just what we do. No, it's actually something really good.
There's potentially a lot of missed learnings as well if we don't sit down and recognise that, isn't there?
Oh, yeah. This conversation went for an hour, and they were just bouncing off each other of who did what and how they did it. And said, well, gee, did you get that? That's that was really good. What did you do? And I just sat there and just listened. And I just thought, if I hadn't started and told them to pause and tell your story, we wouldn't have got this. Everybody just would have walked away and said, I dodged a bullet. You didn't dodge a bullet. No, you were very good in your management. And I think part of this whole mental health side of it is that we can get overwhelmed by when it's really challenging. But when we do make good decisions in challenging times and the outcome's pretty positive for us, we don't want to just forget about it and just go, well, that's just what we did. It's a really positive thing that we should be celebrating and recognising.
Yeah, our first podcast that went to air was a guy called Mark Coleman and went through some significant bushfires in Licola, and one of the things that they did is, as a community, got together and they recognised a couple of mates that weren't turning up, so they actually literally drove around to their place, put them in the car and brought them back. And that conversation around a barbecue, having a beer and a lamb chop, is when a lot of that sort of stuff came out, not only checking in on your mates, but also saying, well, what are you doing and how are you battling this and what can we do to do it better? And there's an old expression, I guess, a problem shared is a problem halved, and that's a really good point to go on with. But we did digress. We'll get back to fertiliser because that's why one of the main reasons in the area. You talk Liebigs, is that how I say it?
Yeah, or Liebigs.
Liebigs, yep. Law of minimums and the law of diminishing returns. Can you walk us through that very briefly?
Yeah, so they're two principles that are, I think, vital for farmers understanding, if you're going to put fertiliser on, how we should focus or how we should think about it.
Yeah.
So the first one, Liebig's law of the minimum, sometimes referred to as the lowest hole in the barrel or lowest stave in the barrel. The principle is essentially that your production will be limited by the most limiting nutrient, not the most abundant one.
Right.
So you can have lots of nutrients that you've got lots of, but what will be holding you back is the one that is in lowest supply.
Yeah.
And so as long as we can clearly identify what that is, that's the one we should focus on. But the caveat with that is that we focus on that only to a point when we reach the next most limiting factor. And I've seen at times when people go, I put this fertiliser on, it worked really well because it was limiting. And then they just kept the focus on that fertiliser when, after a certain period, that was no longer the most limiting one, something else was, but they hadn't changed their thinking.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're investing a whole lot of money in something, weren't getting a response and saying it's my fertiliser not working anymore, but to paraphrase it, I'm not getting the value out of it that I should be getting out of it because that was now no longer the most limiting. Something else had become most limiting because you'd fixed that one. So the skill in being able to, in a sense, jump between them and understand if I do this, is this still the most limiting or is something else? It's an important one.
So your fertiliser program on farm would look very different, probably not very different, but it would be different each year, and paddock to paddock it would be different.
Absolutely. I mentioned in the talks that I've given that because of my background, I've sort of gone through that agronomy side of it, we soil test every paddock every 3 years and have for the last 35 years. So I imagine we're pretty unique in the country from a commercial farming point of view to actually know that. People go, it's a lot of money you spend on soil testing, but when I've worked it out, the soil testing is about 1.5% of our total fertiliser, lime and gypsum. So it's not actually big, but if I'm going to spend big amounts of money, I want to make sure I get the right rate and the right type, that I'm not addressing the most limiting factor.
Because you could easily spend a lot of money that is not effective.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So once you understand that principle, that becomes really important. So when you go through the soil test, you're going, what's most limiting and up to what point is it most limiting before something else becomes most limiting? So that's Liebig's law of the minimum or the lowest hole or lowest stave in the barrel.
And the diminishing returns.
So the diminishing returns is that all biological systems are not the response in a biological system is not a straight line. It's what's called a diminishing curve. So when you're really deficient, a certain level of input gives you quite a big response. It's like big bang for your buck. Okay? But as you start to get up to saturation or the maximum that system requires, the investment, that same investment doesn't give you the same response. It's a diminishing response. And so that's important to understand where you are on that curve, if you like. Are we down low that every investment's going to give me a big bang for my buck, or are we somewhere in the system where an investment's only going to give me a small bang for my buck?
So someone sitting down at home working out a fertiliser budget and think, I need to drive more production, they'll actually want to be down the lower end of the scale in the sense that they could get a bigger return from less money.
Potentially, if they've got the plant species that respond.
Yes.
So as long as your pasture's right, and you do that other thing we talked before about the grazing, so that we can grow fat leaves rather than, So all of that's got to come into it to get that response. So it's not just, I put fertilizer out, everything's going to be solved for me. There's other components with that as well. But as a general idea, you're right. If you're down that lower end of that curve, you'll get a better response than if you're up the top end of the curve.
Yep. Now these curves, can we find them just online if we're looking at, say, Olsen P or something?
Not really.
No, that's annoying.
They're a little bit challenging to get. There is some fabulous research that was done collated by a fellow by the name of Cameron Gourlay from down in Ellenbank, and I think it's called Better Fertilizer Decisions, I think it might be called. And it's got all that information and the curves in there and the equations for the curves and stuff like that. It is online, but it's not obvious find. You've got to go sort of hunting for it.
You almost need a degree to find them.
Well, sort of, and then be able to convert them and do what you need to do with them. So the calculator that I made sort of does that for you.
We'll talk about that calculator in a minute, but before then, now I brought in a soil test here. It might be from my farm. Not that I want free advice, it's purely for the listeners. But if you did get this soil test, now obviously you can't see it, but we can talk through it. If you got that soil test, what are some of the things that you'll be looking for as a consultant, or if it was on your own place even?
Okay. So soil test contains a lot of information.
Yes.
Some of it is around the available nutrients for the plants to grow, but there's an awful lot of information that influences or should inform the rate and type of fertiliser you use and the way that soil will react to certain nutrients that you put on or certain fertilisers that you put on. And then there's other information about some other things we know that can limit plant growth, and if they're above a certain threshold, then they will cause a problem to you, but if they're below that, they won't cause you a problem. It's a bit like, you can get a vitamin deficiency, but once you get above a certain level, no problem. So there's a whole lot of information on a soil test. I concentrate, from a nutrient point of view, concentrate on three things: phosphorus, potassium and sulphur, because I've found in my experience that 90 to 95% of the most limiting factor, if we go back to that Liebig's law, the most limiting factor will be in one of those three nutrients. That will be limiting before anything else will be. Even though some of them mightn't be perfect, other things mightn't be perfect, those three will be the most limiting. I'd focus on first, and the other one is pH or acidity of the soil. That's what I put in as my fourth. So they're the big four that I look at to start with.
So why do we focus so much on N when we're talking with pastures and crops and things like that?
So nitrogen is a incredibly important nutrient, and particularly for rapid response. The biggest challenge with nitrogen and soil testing is that nitrogen changes both. So there's two broad forms of nitrogen that you can test for. One is what's called nitrate nitrogen, and the other one's ammonium nitrogen. Plants prefer to suck up nitrate nitrogen, and then once most of that's depleted, they will take up ammonium nitrogen. Ammonium nitrogen will convert to nitrate nitrogen as well with the bugs in the soil, so one can swing to the other. But they change or turn over very rapidly. So nitrate nitrogen moves through the soil very easily with water, sort of dissolves in water. So it's a bit like cordial in water. Once you get it in there, it'll go wherever the water goes.
Right.
So if you're getting runoff, you'll lose nitrogen that way, where you won't with some of the other nutrients. It can also leach below the roots if the water's draining below the roots, where those other nutrients don't move the same way. So it means that nitrogen on a soil test, particularly a pasture soil test, is only of value for a very short period after you've taken it.
Right.
After that, the confidence you'd have that that's the nitrogen 6 or 12 months later
is very low.
Very, very low.
Yeah.
So that's why, while nitrogen's super important, I don't worry too much about it in a soil test, except to just look at, whenever that soil test was taken, do we have broadly high levels of nitrogen or do we have low levels of nitrogen?
So you'll target your nitrogen applications when the plants will be needing it at certain times of the year.
Yeah, and it's particularly when related to rates of growth and trying to stimulate rates of growth or increase rates of growth. And nitrogen does the same sort of thing broadly. It makes leaves expand more, makes the leaves bigger.
Which we want.
Yeah, which in a really quick way. But just on that, if I look at the nitrogen and both the nitrate and the ammonium are very low, I'd then start questions about how much legume have you got in your pasture, clovers in your pasture, whatever it might be, to fix natural nitrogen. Because if you've got a good base of that and that's built up over a number of years, that number should be naturally high. So I'd look at that and go, hang on, have you got enough of the desirable species that we want in there to naturally put nitrogen in if this number's really low?
Yeah.
But if the soil test comes out pretty high, I go, tick, we've obviously got some legume in this, otherwise it wouldn't be this high, and we'll just move on.
Heard that before, more of an indicator of species in your mixtures.
It's a useful one just to get a bit of a handle on that.
Yeah.
It's not perfect, long way from perfect, but it does give you a bit of a heads up.
Yep. So looking at PKS and...
You want me to look at numbers?
Just have a quick look and...
So phosphorus numbers are really good. So they would sit, if we were talking about where you are on the full production, your phosphorus would be around probably, work off the top of my head, about 95, 98%.
Right.
So you're right up the top end.
And what is that number there?
So this is a Olsen phosphorus of 19
Yep.
or a Colville of 48. And that might mean too much to people, but they're pretty good levels for broadacre beef, sheep
Yep.
grazing. Probably a bit low if you were dairy farming. But
Yep.
for the sort of stuff we're doing, that's pretty good. Your potassium level is about 160. Now, potassium is the level that you'd like it to be at, or how far up that towards 100% you are, is
Right.
dependent on the texture of your soil.
Yes.
Okay, if the soil is lighter, and by lighter meaning more sand,
Yep.
more loamy type soils, that number can be lower than if it's a clay.
Right.
So if it's a clay, it's got a heavier number. So you've got a sandy loam here. The potassium in that 160, so that's tracking along well as well.
Yeah.
So you'd be up around a sort of 90 on that. And if I look at the sulphur, your sulphur levels there at 14, and ideally anything above about 8 is pretty good. So
Right.
so those three, if you're drawing staves in the barrel, they'd be right up towards the top of the barrel.
Yeah.
The fourth one, the last one of the big four, is your pH, and your pH is okay, but that will be the most limiting. And it depends a bit on the types of pasture species you're trying to grow, because some pasture species are more sensitive than others to low pH and aluminium, which is associated with that. So your pH in calcium chloride is 4.7. So what sort of species are growing on this, Al?
Rubbish.
Rubbish.
It's
Okay.
just a new block, and we've started a program. So we did put out 1.5 tons of lime
Yep.
over there, and the idea is now to go back in and spray out and start to look at a renovation program.
Okay.
So, but what I'm liked most about, I'm not sure if it's available readily, but the tool that you've built, I'm assuming you built that whole Excel tool.
Yes. Yeah.
So the thing that's so wonderful about that tool is you can actually put in these numbers here and say what desirables you want in that paddock, and then from that there's a whole bunch of other tools in that Excel spreadsheet to go, this is how much money I have, what sort of fertilizer should I be looking at. Can you just talk us a little bit through your Excel program that you've got there?
Yeah, so it was trying to put some logical steps behind, if I was talking with a client, this is the way we need to go about analysing this stuff. So what you've got me to do is really the first few steps of the calculator that I'd created, or the little thing that I created, where you put your soil test numbers in and know whether you're good, bad or ugly.
Yep.
Basically trying to identify the lowest stave in the barrel and where those other ones are sitting relative to that lowest one. So I'd just read it off the top of my head, not putting it in the calculator, but you've got a fair bit of opportunity to increase that pH. So that lime, that 1.5 tons of lime that you've put on will help. If you put in the calculator, put 1.5 tons of lime on, it will make an estimate of how much that's improved. But I suspect 1.5 tons of lime, local lime, so it was...
Yeah, the buck and lime, I think
okay,
it was.
so
Yep.
pretty high purity, low moisture. So 1.5 tons, you're basically getting 1.5 tons of product, where some other natural gypsum lime pits can have quite a bit of water in them. It can also be lower in purity. So you've put on something that's obviously pretty good purity-wise. That will raise it, but I suspect, given the other numbers, lime or pH will still be a more limiting factor than some of the
You're
others.
spot on there, because I did put it in the calculator, and I think it worked out to be about 3.7 tonne I needed.
To get it up to the level of where
To get it
those
up to
other
the
ones.
lowest.
Yeah. So that's how the calculator can sort of be used. Or you say, look, I can only afford 1.5 tons. How much does that improve it by? Knowing you're still not maybe right at the top, but how much can you improve it by? The other bit in the calculator, and when I first started in the ag department, our aim was to get all of our soils up so they could produce 95% of maximum production. So in other words, we had our nutrients and our pH and everything else right, so you could grow 95%. You wouldn't get 100%, but that last 5% was going to cost a lot of investment, if you like, not much return. A lot of the soil tests we're seeing now, and particularly with the cost of fertiliser and the returns you get from livestock, that equation in a sense has changed a bit. So it's not uncommon I see soil tests that say, you need to put this much fertiliser on. It's based on getting it to 95%. But if some people are a long way away from that, that has to be a stepping stone towards 95%. And so the calculator allows you to say, okay, I'm not going to get to 95% because that's a huge jump. What if I try and get to 80% or 85%? What do I need? So you can set your own targets, so to speak, in there, and it calculates the nutrients required to get to those targets.
Yeah. And you can forecast that over a couple of years too, I notice. So if you say I want a program over 3 years or 1 year or...
Yeah, so you can say, look, I want to achieve this by the end of 3 years, and it gives you a chance to set those different numbers. So that, again, important. The other thing I've found is that there are people that are now wanting to look at some alternative ways of supplying nutrients. And so, when I first started, it was these 3 or 4 types of fertilisers, what you had. So manufactured a single superphosphate made of potash, blends of those, how many scoops of single super and murate made up super potash, 1 in 1, 2 in 1, 5 in 1, those sort of things. DAP, MAP, that sort of... Where now some people are looking at some other alternatives, and I don't really mind as long as you know what nutrients you need to apply and you find the products that will apply those nutrients. And so the calculator does have some generic, you might call organic type ones, chook manure, pig manure.
Fish emulsion or so.
I'll put a few of those in. Compost, a few of those. And now, the rider on those is that sometimes they can be variable.
They're very different, aren't they, sometimes?
Yeah, so getting a test is super important. And a few people ask me, can I put my own numbers in because I've made up a blend or I've done something else?
I'll muck it up on you.
Yeah, so I haven't got that at the moment, but that might come in the next version. But it allows you to see, if I use this alternative product, where do I get to? And, sometimes people say, I'll spend the equivalent money that I would have spent on, say, a manufactured fertiliser in one of these, let's say organic, for want of a better word, But when you spend the same amount of money, the quantity you're putting on doesn't put anywhere near the nutrients that you actually need. So you think you've done all right because you've spent the same amount of money on it, but in fact, we need to put, say, 10 kilograms of phosphorus to maintain our thing, and this product we've put on's only got 3 kilograms of phosphorus in it. So in fact, we're going backwards even though we think we're doing the right thing. So this just gives people an opportunity to sort of play around with that and find out, if I use these alternative products at whatever price they are and we spend the equivalent amount of money, what's the difference between them?
The quick little play that we had out there was just amazing how it simplified the process. And then, like you said, just have a play, this is what I want to do. And the language, you don't have to understand the language at all because it's all there, ready to go for you. Yeah,
you've got choices. And so you can just play around with the choice. So I suppose the trickiest thing is you need to have a reasonably good idea of current price.
Yes. I was going to ask that, where do we find, is there a place we can find that, or is it literally you ring up your local and say...
I ring up a local. I've got a fella in Geelong who does ours, and he's great. I just say, look, can you give me the current prices on these for you? And he just says, this is what I could supply it to you for. And
because it's so volatile, isn't it?
It can bounce around. It's much more volatile in the last 5-10 years than it has been historically. I've actually collected information of, say, like the price of superphosphate over the last 25 or 30 years. And for a long period of time, it was remarkably stable if you account for inflation. And then we had a period, the first one was when the global financial crisis was, and it bumped up and then levelled off, but at a higher level. And then we've had another one through this COVID period where it's bumped up again. But the volatility has certainly increased compared to what historically we've lived through. Yeah, you could sort of, fertiliser will be about this. May not be.
Yep. Now, another interesting point that you made out there, some people will say, I can't afford put any fertiliser out even for a maintenance this year. But that's actually, it's not as simple as the equation gets. Can you tell us what you're talking about out there?
Yeah. So there's another principle that I touched on, and it's that if we are producing products on our farm and we're selling them outside the farm gate, we're actually exporting nutrients, okay? Now, in grain, we tend to export more nutrients because we turn off tons of grain, tons of product. In livestock, we might be turning off 400 or 500 kilograms of beef, let's say, per hectare out the gate. So it's not as much, but it's still nutrients. If you cut hay and you sell it to a neighbour, you're exporting nutrients, particularly potassium in hay and silage and fodders. It's a law of physics and a law of chemistry that we can't just keep mining it and expecting it to appear out of nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's important, if you decide not to do anything, but you sell products off, that you appreciate that you're actually changing the total balance in your soil. Now, if you've got a nutrient in that soil that is in huge quantities, and I made the example that in southwest Victoria on our basalt soils that are relatively new volcanic soils, they have huge amounts of potassium in them. So we can export potassium off them and not change the potassium levels in our soil because there is just so much of it. There is so much excess of it, you can take some out. It is depleting, but still nowhere near causing us a problem. But other nutrients that we might be much lower on in that pool, if you're taking them off and not putting them back on, you will actually start sliding down that law of diminishing returns.
Yep. So at the end of the day, that means less grown and then less DSE per hectare.
Well, potentially, yes. Yes. So the way of trying to understand, well, how much is this costing me? Because if you think about it, I'm not spending any money, so it's not costing me anything. But in fact, it will catch up with you in lowering your production if you're on that critical level. If everything's huge, you can go for a year, you run it down a bit, but you're still at 100% production, no impact, so to speak.
Yep.
You've used up some nutrients, but from a production system hasn't made a difference. But if you've reduced those nutrients and say you've gone from 90% production to 80% production because you haven't put anything on, but you've shot the stuff out the gate, you've just dropped 10%. Now, most people in the short term, that plays out by animals not growing as fast because you haven't grown as much feed. But to try and calculate what that is, I've just said, if you had the same utilisation, so you're eating the same amount, but you've grown 10% less feed, what does that do to lower your stocking rate? Yep. And if you know that a DSE with the operation I run is worth $70 a DSE, and you've lost 1.5 DSE, then you've lost $120. That's what, if you like, theoretically it's cost you. Yep. Even though it mightn't have, you don't see it coming out of you. You don't pay for it in that, of transferred money.
You pay for it at the back end of the year, not the front end.
You pay for it in a less recognised way than writing a cheque or doing a funds transfer for an invoice. And the ability to know, if I don't do it on this paddock, it's not going to cost me much, but if I do it on this paddock, it's going to cost me quite a bit. It's going to have quite a big impact. Knowing the difference between those two should inform your decision. Okay, I've still got to put it on this one, but I can let this one slide. Yep.
Now, we're coming close to the end. Just that Excel program that you've written, is that commercially available or available for producers?
Not at the moment. I've been doing it with the courses and so the GAG stuff that we've been doing here.
Yep.
So I haven't been keen to sort of put it out there or make it commercial at this stage until we iron all the bugs out of it.
And our signature question, which we always finish on with our guest, is what is something that you've learnt recently that has surprised you?
Probably that one I sort of alluded to before about the farmers up around Horsham, north of Horsham, we're doing that discussion. Just how clever they were at solving a really tough problem, and then how we didn't reflect and say, hey, we're actually pretty good at this game. It was almost like, yeah, but that's just what we do. And I think of a whole lot of other professions, and if people do things like that and really pull off something big like that, they're celebrated and they're recognised, and we're not shy to recognise it in ourselves. We've actually pulled off something pretty big. Ag just doesn't seem to do that. And I think it's to our detriment that we don't recognise people that really do a good job in tough times and get through it. We just think we've just got out of that, or I'm glad that's over. But if you reflect on it, you've done some fantastic things and you're highly skilled in what you do if you can pull that off.
I think it's a nice little point to finish on, not only celebrating your own, but celebrate the neighbours or the other people that you associate with as well. Build them up and push what they're doing
absolutely,
well.
Absolutely. And I think if I've learned something, it's that we don't do that enough.
No.
And I'm as guilty as anybody in doing that. You just push on. Yes, I've got over that hump, just push on. But stop and just reflect is, I think, a really important thing that I'll be doing more of.
That's a challenge for anyone that's listening. Start celebrating their wins.
Beautiful.
Nice note to finish on. Thanks very much, Cam.
Okay, good, Al.
A big thank you for tuning in today. And remember, if you have a question about today's episode or a topic you'd like us to cover, reach out to one of our many platforms and join the conversation. We're here because of your passion and commitment to agriculture. Together, we can build a stronger farming future.
This podcast is made possible by the Future Drought Fund Regional Drought Resilience Planning Program, co-funded by the Victorian and Australian governments.